Good afternoon to everybody in the East, and good morning to those of you in the West. I'm Dan Markind. I'm here with my fellow shareholders, Frank Riesenberger, Marty Judge, and our newest shareholder, Lauren Schwimmer, effective at the beginning of the year. And for the next hour, we're going to talk about airports and PFAS. Now, we are both gratified and a little surprised that when we sent out the invitations, we advertised this as being something that concentrates on New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, but the response that we have gotten is from all over the country. So we are going to be a little less mid-Atlantic centric and more national in scope. We did this program last year, and we took an hour and a half, but we spent about 45 minutes really talking about PFAS, what it is, and all that sort of thing. And we figure that by now you've already had your fill of that. So Frank will go into some of that, but we've cut that part out of it, and we're going to be concentrating on airports and PFAS and environmental aspects and other management and operational situations. Now, because we're lawyers, we have to give our disclaimers. So the first is that since we're lawyers, we need to include a legal disclaimer in the slide deck to inform you that this webinar is for general purposes only and not legal advice. Second, this webinar has been approved for one Pennsylvania and New Jersey CLE credit. Unfortunately, we can't offer that to anyone outside of those states. If you're interested in receiving CLE credit, please email your name and bar ID numbers to the website at marketing@flastergreenberg.com. Also, due to the complexity of the topic, we're currently recording this webinar, but our attendees will be able to easily revert back to any PowerPoint slide that's not covered in its entirety. Our marketing department will send you a link to the webinar as soon as it's live on our firm's YouTube channel. And for that, I also want to give a special thanks to Molly Graham and to Roger Rancis, who are providing all of the expert help. Finally, if you have a question during any point of this presentation, please click on the chat icon located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to send your question to our panelists. We have carved out a few minutes at the end of this presentation for Q&A. The agenda for this is going to be as follows. We're going to start with Lauren giving the current status of FAA and other federal regulations regarding PFAS in airports. Then Frank is going to give general PFAS issues and specific state initiatives. I will be providing how to look at and address these issues from an airport perspective. And finally, Marty will talk about pitfalls to look for from an environmental perspective, both federal and state. And then we'll end with Q&A. I will tell you that both Lauren and I came to Flaster Greenberg a little over a year ago, and one of the major reasons we came was the environmental expertise of people like Frank and Marty, which really are unparalleled and second to none. Finally, I don't know, before we even start, I'm going to take 30 seconds out and say, I don't know if he's on the call. He is pre-registered. But to give a shout out to Tom Devine, who is been the head of the ACI Legal Committee for about the last decade. Tom announced his retirement, I believe, on Monday, and Tom actually was sitting right next to me on September 11th, 2001, at the ACI Legal Committee, discussions in Montreal, and we shared a bunch of experiences together that are burned forever within you. Tom, it's been a pleasure, and I think I speak for all of us all over the country when I say thank you, job well done, and we will miss you. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lauren Schwimmer, to get the ball rolling. The topic, her aspect of this is a little bit dry. You know most of it, but it's important to get this, everybody on the same page. So please take it away, Lauren.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning. I'm Lauren Schwimmer, and I'm an attorney in the Aviation and Corporates Department, and it's always great when your introduction says your stuff's going to be dry. But as Dan said, I will try to make it as interesting as possible and give you an update as to the current status of the FAA and other federal regulations. As you are all probably aware, on October 5th, 2018, the FAA Reauthorization Act was signed by the President and became public law. I included the pertinent portion of the slide on the PowerPoint. And as Dan mentioned, you will be also getting a copy of the PowerPoint in the webinar, so you can look and read at your leisure. But the Act changes it so the airports will no longer be required to use PFAS in the firefighting foam they used 3 years from the date of enactment of the Act. prior to the authorization of this act, airports were obligated to purchase firefighting foam, or AFFF, that met military specifications, in particular, Military Specification 24385. This was required as a result of 14 CFR Part 139, and specifically 139.317, and the FAA Advisory Circular on Aircraft Fire Extinguishing Agents, which require airports to have used AFFF that meet these strict performance requirements. Indeed, the AFFF has been used for extinguishing fires and for firefighter training at airports for decades. And currently, there are no fluorine-free foams that match the performance of AFFF, although lately some senators are disagreeing with this fact and pointing to the fact that airports over the world, all around the world, have been using non-fluoride foam for a while and seem to be able to fight fires. Regardless, AFFF is still the standard right now and used in training, testing, and/or as a result of a discharge from deluge systems and aircraft hangars. The FAA began efforts earlier this year to help mitigate the potential hazards of AFFF and to deal with the growing concerns, and also because of the enactment of the Act. In particular, they are researching to find environmentally friendly yet effective firefighting foams, including even constructing a whole new research facility devoted to testing for these alternatives. On January 17, 2019, the agency issued a CERT Alert 19-01 to give airports alternatives to the biannual AFFF testing that was required to maintain ARFF vehicles and fire suppression operating systems. This was recently replaced by CERT Alert number 19-02 on October 29, 2019. The new CERT Alert is basically the same to the initial version, but has a couple of notable changes. One, it omits the discussion of the FAA work currently underway to evaluate fluorine-free alternatives, and omits the FAA's opinion that fluorine-free foams on the market do not match the performance of their fluorinated counterparts. It also omits the statement that if the airport operator does not conduct the testing prior to its inspection, that they will be required to discharge AFFF during the periodic inspection. Now it just says the airport will be required to test at the time. The FAA Technical Center also initiated research on 3 types of AFFF testing equipment, and now that research has been complete. And the FAA will accept use of the systems that are listed on the slide there as options to test the AFFF function on ARFF vehicles. I should add there is also a note in the CERT Alert regarding the need for the airport operators to coordinate proportioning system test procedures with proportioning test system manufacturers if testing 6% AFFF. CERT Alert number 19-02 also had other recommendations, which I also put on this. What I have on the slide there in front of you right now are those recommendations. They're taken straight from the CERT Alert, so I'll let you read them on your own, and in particular when we send out the webinar again. But I do want to note you should definitely check out the website, because that will be given updated periodically and give further guidance. Other notable federal PFAS actions include that on June 27, 2019, the Senate passed legislation to regulate PFAS as a rider to the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. And then it was actually passed by the House on July 12, 2019, but there are significant differences between the version passed by the Senate and the version passed by the House, so it's not actually law yet. But under the Senate version, manufacturers would be required to report air and water discharges of PFAS chemicals by way of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act of 1986 Toxic Release Inventory Requirements. The Department of Defense would be required to phase out PFAS in its fire-suppressing foam by 2023, and the EPA would be required to establish safe drinking water limits for PFOA and PFOS under the Safe Drinking Water Act. As well as within 1 year of the amendment's passage, the AP will be required to publish interim guidance on the destruction and disposal of PFOA and PFOS contaminated materials, and would be required to promulgate drinking MCLS for those chemicals within 2 years of the enactment. As I mentioned, though, there are some significant differences, the most important being the House version also classifies PFAS as hazardous under CERCLA, which Frank and Marty will be talking about more later. And it is not believed that senators will agree to this. there's also some gaps on funding. So currently, the National Defense Authorization Act is in conference. The most recent update was on Tuesday, November 5th. The Senate Armed Services Chairman said that negotiations are inching forward after he received a counteroffer from his House counterpart, but it's expected states will continue to drive the process, at least in the near immediate future, and maybe even longer. And the next question, what about all the other federal agencies? Well, I'm sure this surprises no one on this webinar call. They are disagreeing a little bit and fighting and not having nearly as much fun as those kids on that slide. A DoD memo distributed across military leadership in October sets the screening levels for the chemicals that is 10 times higher than what the EPA recommended last spring. As such, screening levels are used as thresholds to determine whether the military must further investigate and potentially clean a chemical contamination, or whether it can simply disregard it and take no further action. This is very important. The DoD memo does advise that when multiple PFAS are found, the screening levels drops to 40 parts per trillion. However, it's unclear what multiple PFAS means. And the memo makes no mention of the EPA's 70 parts per trillion groundwater cleanup goals. Shoot it out, pretending it was fake snow. See, yes, so I did add some bump to this slide. Here you go.
Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Frank Wiesenberger. I've been an environmental practitioner. 3 weeks after I was admitted to the bar, I got my first environmental case, and in various iterations, it lasted until 1993. Today, we have a very complex subject that we're going to try to simplify a little bit. Because it's complex, please feel reassured that you will be able to get copies of these slides by just asking us for them. We will run through them rather rapidly because there's a lot of ground to cover. My first area is to try to simplify things. It's a nomenclature correction. The number of PFASs have been estimated to be 4,000 plus. I just read another item that says it's 6,000 plus. Actually, only 14 have been studied in a National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which examined blood levels, and 2 others have been identified from blood monitoring of different types. A total of 16 is what is at play here in terms of the polyfluoroalkyls of concern, and that's what I think that they should be named. From that 16, you get a total of 5 that are that need attention, and I call them the polyfluoroalkyls of concern. They are, as noted, PFBA, PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFHXS. Now we go to our toolbox. I want to go through rapidly with you some things that you need to know that form part of your toolbox. First of all, the health concerns in human are diffuse. It's not like you see on TV, the various advertisements for people who maybe use Roundup, that there is a specific ailment, which is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. No, the EPI studies here show a wide range of possible human concerns, which will make it more difficult for people to prove, if they want to try to prove, why they're impacted, why their liver damage or their increased risk of thyroid disease or their increased risk of asthma diagnosis is going to have been impacted by a PFAC item. You can see here the various health concerns and the various PFACs that are perhaps going to be attributed to a development of those conditions. Very importantly, the last bullet talks about the possibility of carcinogenic reactions, and suggestive evidence maybe indicates that there's a carcinogenic potential which hasn't been shown yet. Importantly, exposure, time, and place is important. The longer that somebody is exposed to these materials, the more likelihood that there's going to be an adverse health effect. The more likely that you're close to a location of a military installation or some other facility that uses a lot of PFACs, the more likely that a person may be influenced by, in some way, have adverse health effects from that exposure. So you got time and place being very important. Next, we go over an overview. An overview as to the fact that you're not alone. My God, this stuff is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Routes of exposure you see here, it goes through the water, goes through the food, dust, inhalation, mouth-to-mouth transfers. You pick up a sandwich, it's wrapped in a paper product. That paper product has PFAC all over it so that it doesn't stick to the paper, which is protected. There are so many ways in which the PFACs are involved in our daily life that it is ubiquitous. Now, what are the most likely candidates for having large amounts of PFACs? And again, these are noted because sometimes they're locally next to your airport. Sometimes they may be adjacent to your airport. Sometimes they may be impacting the surface water body of which your airport is around. It's important to know that these are other players: military installations, national priorities with silent circuit, the fluorochemical manufacturing processing locations, and there's 8 of them, 8 companies that are involved, and you see the 8 companies listed there. The private and community water supply systems are also going to be impacted. Now, I love to talk about T-shirt sizes. If I had a double extra large T-shirt size, I would put it on the military installations. Where do you fit in this? I would give you about a toddler 3. There are so many other players that are going to be bigger and more pronounced in terms of impacts that they may suffer from the PFACs. Please understand that while you may be a toddler 3 size, DuPont is using the airports for its advantage. DuPont is saying that if there is any legislation which indicates that the PFACs are going to be termed as a hazardous substance, then they are going to go after everybody, including the airports. So everyone is at risk. Everyone's got to pay attention to what's going on, and things move along very quickly. Next, we have the lowest laboratory limits of detection. We're talking about parts per trillion. You're probably familiar with the drinking water method 537 and 537.1, and there are some claims. Some people claim, like Anderson 2016 claims, that he can have an accurate and repeated test for soil. The state of New Jersey doesn't recognize that. In many states, there is no ability to test for soil yet. Next, we want to go look at the numbers and drill down, really drill down real big time here. The numbers are astronomical in terms of what has been found in different media. You look at the 3 items: surface water, groundwater, drinking water. These are all parts per billion. You'll see that surface water has been found as high as 67 million parts per billion. The groundwater has been found as high as 619,000 parts per trillion. In food, you've had as high as 290,000 parts per trillion, primarily because of the paper and also because of fish. Fish is very high level in polyfluoroalkyl of concern because of the water basis. Next slide I want you to pay attention to, and I'm going to go through it as quickly as possible. This is a study done of 10 military installations. Now, if you look at the top, you'll see surface water, subsurface sediment, surface water, and groundwater. On the left-hand side, you'll see the compounds. DF, by the way, on perimeters means number of samples taken, and numbers of those, and the percentage of those taken, how many were positive for the compound noted. As an example, look at PFOS. Across the board, 98.9 all the way down to 84.6. High amounts of samples that were taken turned out to be very, very positive. This is in these 10 military installations. Maximum levels, let's say, of sediment is 190 million parts per trillion. Groundwater, 400 4,300,000 parts per trillion. These are huge numbers, and that's why the military installations with DOD is going to get the badge for the XXX, for the XX extra large T-shirt size. But importantly, as you have a chance to go through this, I would suggest that you look at the DF numbers, because the DF numbers will give you an idea of how prevalent the various types of PFACs are present at various locations. Next, please. I want to go over with you state by state how things are going and what different states are doing. Different states are all over the place, all over the map. California. The California State Water Resource conservation boards are involved in a massive survey. They're collecting information from many locations, actively doing this, requiring that at least 31 airports so far provide information to the state board. What we have here, if you look through the slide, you'll have a drinking water informal guideline of 5.1 for PFOA and 6.5 for PFOS parts per trillion that has been listed as an intended to adopt since September 16th, 2016. That has not yet been adopted. It is an intention, and some states are slow to actually implement a regulation. California is studying it. Next, let's go to Indiana. Indiana has a protected groundwater standard already adopted. It was adopted in 2019, but it's only for PFBS, and it's 400,000 parts per trillion. I think a lot of this has to do with the Lake Monroe and the Monroe. By the way, the Monroe Water Treatment Plant has just come out with a study of 12 of the 16 that I mentioned before, PFASs, and they didn't find any of them. So that's the extent of what Indiana has done. New Jersey, leading the pack in terms of what is being done in the country. New Jersey has adopted regulations for PFNA, and that would be in the groundwater and in the drinking water at 13 parts per trillion. As far as PFOA, there is a drinking water regulation that has been proposed, and that's at 14 parts per trillion. As you know, the national guideline is 70 parts per trillion in the EPA, and then that would be either individually you can't exceed of the two PFOA and PFOS, or totally you can't exceed. In New Jersey, it's PFOA at 14 parts per trillion. Now, very importantly, New Jersey has adopted an interim groundwater standard, and that is for PFOA and PFOS. And the interim standard is 10 parts per trillion. That means that any site in New Jersey that is being subject to an environmental study, an environmental investigation, has to, through its LSRP, I'll explain that some other time for you, through its LSRP, which is a private person that does the work of the NJDEP, hired and licensed by the, hired by the responsible party, licensed by the state. But that person has to do an evaluation of whether, a paper evaluation, of whether there is likely to have been or to be an impact from a source of PFAS. And if that is the case, you cannot close a case which would be site-wide clearance. You can close a particular area of concern and leave it open for later on to be further looked at and investigated. North Carolina in 2006, long time ago, adopted a regulation of 2,000 parts per trillion of PFOA. This has to do with, I imagine it had to do at the time, very early regulation of the Chemours plant in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and some concerns with Cape Fear and the Cape Fear Basin. Next, we have Oregon. Oregon has a standard It's 24,000 parts per trillion and 300,000 parts per trillion for PFOS, and that is for its water concerns. Pennsylvania is the national 70 parts per trillion for both PFOA and PFOS, and Texas has tier 1 groundwater concerns, which is 290 parts per trillion PFOA, 560 parts per trillion FOS, and other ones as well. Vermont, you can see, is at for drinking water and groundwater purposes, is at 20 parts per trillion across the board, and that's again, you can't have an individual item above that amount, nor a total above that amount. As far as others are concerned, New York has a pre-regulatory recommendation of PFOA and PFOS of 10 parts per trillion. Idaho follows, Idaho doesn't have anything, it just says that they follow the federal guidelines. Florida has a level of 6,700 parts per trillion for PFOA in irrigation and 72,000 parts per trillion for PFOS in irrigation. They have also identified, they're in the information stage, they've done a great job of identifying 25 training facilities in Florida, fire training facilities, and 19 military bases that are of concern, and they're trying to work with the DOD to proceed through that. The next slide has to do with converting the parts per billion items numbers into parts per trillion. The next number of slides have to do with the references that will support the items that I've just mentioned as far as the levels are concerned. I'm just going to go through very quickly the concentrations of PFOA and PFOS in surface water. You have to realize surface water is a real concern for the airports. Surface water usually is around the airports. There are lots of studies having to do with what surface waters are like. Here I'm just giving you an example of what the studies were that I was able to find in New York and in North Carolina. They were mostly done in, these were mostly done in 06, 07 time period. There will be others in your state. You'll have to take a look at them and try to find them to get an idea of what the surface water issues may be nearby. And you may not be the only one contributing to it. You may not be contributing at all. There will be lots of other potential folks who are contributing to this issue. Now, in the 06 and 07 time period, that was probably a high time period in terms of the levels. The levels have gone down now because the manufacturing, for the most part, is not done in this state. There's another concentration of other perfluoroalkyls in the surface water. We'll just skip that for a minute. Most importantly, two things. One, form a team. Team FAC, PFAC, and Marty and Dan are going to talk about that far more later on. I just want to add, have one cop who understands what's going on and who says yes, no, and one spokesperson, because you can get a lot of trouble if you don't have just one of each and they can be combined. I just wanted to also look at new fire avoiding foam equipment. This is a budgetary item. You're going to have to put some money aside for this because there has not yet been a way to decontaminate PFAS from existing equipment. Australia is working on that. Next most important thing is the general liability insurance policies. This may be the most important thing I can tell you right now. We don't know how they're going to be used in the future or whether they will be of value to you, but you have to take time to gather them up. I mean, all historical policies, the ones before 1986, are even better than today's policies, which have pollution exclusions. You want to look at general liability policies. Most importantly, look at umbrella policies. Umbrella policies were cheap way back when, and you could get millions of dollars of coverage for as a result of umbrella policies. Don't limit your search just to those policies. You got to go ahead and look at deck sheets, declaration sheets. They're one sheet of paper. It tells you very quickly how much insurance you have and what your retentions are. And also, you want to go back and see who your brokers are, your insurance brokers. I don't care if it's 1960 and you have a letter from an insurance broker, or if you have canceled checks. The last thing I want to tell you is watch out for what's going to happen starting November 22nd. November 22nd, there is a movie being shown for the first time, and it's called Dark Waters, and it is about PFASs. It's about cases involving PFASs. It's probably going to be about 3M having had much information buried in its files that showed the dangers of PFAS as early as the 1960s, and particularly by 1975. It's going to cause a lot of people to say, what the hell is all this all about? It's another impact to the public domain and knowledge of what is going on about this concern, generally called PFAS. For your purposes, it's PFACs. Marty.
Actually, it'll be Dan. Marty will finish up. Thank you, Frank. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about moving on from the technical aspect of it to the airport aspect of it. From the standpoint of an airport manager, an airport operator, an airport legal counsel, an airport consultant, what do you have to do? Interestingly, I did this talk on PFAS just about 2 weeks ago at the state convention in Pennsylvania, and before we had the conference, one of the discussion points was whether or not we should even talk about PFAS, because whether or not all of this was going to be just giving people information that is going to be used to cause trouble. And I told them that, as you see here, already the word's out there. We just grabbed a couple of newspaper items from all over the country, and you can see that no matter where you are in the country, northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest, and everywhere in between, people know and are talking about PFAS. So the one thing that you cannot do is you cannot stick your head in the sand right now. You have to act, and you have to be proactive. What are the basic rules to follow? I have three of them, one from a management standpoint, one from an operational standpoint, and one from a communications public relations standpoint. Most importantly, always protect the boss. What that means is you have to be in position where you can give whoever is in charge, whether it be the airport executive director, whether it be the mayor, whether it be the airport board authority chairperson, whomever, whenever they're asked about PFAS, and they either have been or they will be, they have to have something to say, which means you have to have a plan and you have to be acting on it. Most importantly, you have to understand it. You have to believe what you're saying so that the boss is able to go out in front and talk to people and not be blindsided. From an operational standpoint, when you investigate this, the one thing you don't want to do is start using a scattershot method. This is what I call the Field of Dreams approach. Remember the movie Field of Dreams? If you build it, he will come. Well, in the PFAS context, if you look for it, you will find it. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So the idea that you're going to just go with chickens like chickens with your heads cut off and start looking all over your airport, in and around your airport for PFAS is silly for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of them is that you're going to find it everywhere. It's in your clothes. It's in the food. It's in your wrappers. Third, from a communication standpoint, do not demonize your opposition. You're going to find that you're having a lot of people all of a sudden start looking at the airports from an environmental context that you've never seen before. A lot of you who deal with airports or who are counsels to airports or managers of airports have dealt with things like noise. We've been dealing with noise for God knows how long. This is something that takes this to a level 10 times that. You're going to find the intensity of environmental questions and perhaps opposition relating to PFAS, the absurdity of some of the suggestions, like you have to go to a PFAS 0 level and the airport has got to clean everything up throughout the entire airport. You're going to find all these things that you end up with hearing, and it's important that you appreciate that there are different types of people out there. Some of them are very, very just concerned citizens. Some of them are real environmentalists, and some of them are just professional troublemakers. You can argue with them. You can you put what you believe right out front, but do not demonize them. It will only backfire on you. Understand that PFAS affects airport management in all different ways. It doesn't just affect it from an environmental protection standpoint. It affects it from a master planning standpoint. We've had some major discussions in the last week about this, about whether or not if you have a location that on your master plan, or if you're going through that master planning process now, you're looking at for development, and yet you realize that it's likely that PFAS has been located there in substantial quantities. What can you do with it? Must you leave it fallow? Can you build a runway over it? Can you build hangars on it? Very important, and if you're a consultant and you're not looking at PFAS issues, you're not doing your job. is involved in budgeting, in grants. Is PFAS remediation, PFAS investigation going to be available for FAA grant money? A lot of this stuff is unclear. Finally, it's involved in your airport agreements. Whatever agreement you have with anybody should contain certain PFAS language. How specific you are, how in-depth you are, will depend on both the size of your airport, what you can get away with, and the importance of the PFAS in your airport vicinity, but you should always be aware of that issue as well. I love this slide because it has nothing to do with PFAS, yet it illustrates the point. This comes from the energy world. This comes from actually the oil and gas area, where there was a problem when people who were studying methane contamination were wondering why it was that different labs kept getting different results. So they gave different labs different studies, different samples from different wells, and had them different exposures, different collection times, and had the different labs try to come up with what should have been the same result. The results were all over the map. What this shows is what Frank said, that people really don't even know yet how to investigate this. And there aren't that many labs in the country who really know what they're doing. PFAS has to be handled different ways according to where the samples come from. You handle groundwater samples differently than you handle samples from just the ground and from other places. So you have to be extremely careful, not just in who are the consultants that you use, who are the lawyers that you use. They have to have experience with this stuff, but also who are the labs that you use. You could end up with an awful lot of false positives because, as Frank said, you're talking about parts per trillion here. That's take a dropper, stick it in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and then put a couple of drops on the side of the pool. That's parts per trillion. In terms of the intensity of the opposition, this comes from something that probably a lot of you remember. These were the protests at the Dakota Access Pipeline up in North Dakota, the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, and I'm sure that you saw all these pictures. And you're going to face stuff, like I said, that you haven't noticed. Let me show you a story that you didn't see. After the protest ended, those protesters left 2,500 pickup trucks worth of garbage, 400 tons of garbage that were left actually in an extremely environmentally precarious place along the floodplain of the Cannonball River that could have contaminated the water supply to hundreds of thousands of people. This story you heard, this story you didn't hear. Point being, from a communication standpoint, you're not necessarily going to control the narrative. The narrative is going to be what the public wants to hear, what the media wants to hear, but you have to have the story to tell that you believe in and is honest and legitimate, and that's extraordinarily important. But remember, again, for all airport people, you're about to get involved in an environmental context, environmental investigation, environmental intensity that you haven't seen before. What do you look for? One of the great things you can do is go get your aerials. I'm going back to my earlier formative days as general counsel at PHL back in the mid-90s. Here's a look at PHL and aerial airport, of the airport circa 2019. Don't just stand, or just don't stop there. Go back to the old ones. Here's an aerial from 2008. One of the things it shows you is that a lot of the places were mapped. You can see we pointed out the fire training facility, and you go through your old documents there to find out where the areas were that PFAS was likely to have been either stored, used, or spilled. Here are some of the locations you can investigate and prioritize: historical military facilities, ARC training sites, other things. These are all, I'm not going to go through them all, but get a priority list of places to look and then figure out where you're going to look. Take your aerials and understand also where the geology and the topography means that the ground, that where any firefighting foam would have gotten spilled, would have ended up into the groundwater. And this is different in different places. Here's LaGuardia, all 580 acres of it. Notice that at the bottom of the screen, it's in a very, very congested residential area. At the top, you've got the East River, and you have to understand if you spill something in LaGuardia, where is it going to go? How is it going to get into the groundwater? How is it going to get into the East River and then into the Atlantic Ocean? And that can be extremely different than, for example, El Paso, which is a much larger facility, much more arid area. Many places are much more barren. But again, it's got its own interesting water problems. Also, don't be limiting yourself to just your airport when you take a look at these aerials and take a look at all the old documentation that you have. Because you take a look at a place like El Paso, and you'll notice that north of it is Biggs Army Airfield. Well, a lot of AFFF has been used at the airfield, and they could be another potentially responsible party, what's known in environmental law as a PRP, for anything that involves an environmental contamination. Here's PHL. We expand the map out. You see the PHL is not too far from the Navy Yard, the old Navy Yard, and not too far from where what's listed as Philadelphia Energy Solutions. Those are the old oil refineries. There was a big fire there a couple of months ago. They've actually driven those refineries bankrupt. But all of those have been contributing to the pollution that comes from the AFFF. So be very careful. Don't limit yourself to your own topography. Look around you. Look at other potentially responsible parties. There's so much to go into. We can only scratch the surface here on this segment of it, and I'll turn it over to Marty to talk about the environmental pitfalls.
Okay. So my topic, I would like to deal with at a little bit higher level and give some big picture PFAS recommendations that may be useful to try to avoid liability and to resolve situations where you already have liability. Just a really quick word about my background. I've been doing this since the early 1980s, that is primarily environmental law, and I've been through many battles like this over the course of time where situations have gotten, shall we say, out of hand, and mass hysteria among the general public, and sometimes the intervention of environmentalists who, however well-meaning, just don't really appreciate the big picture has gotten in the way. A good example of, I think 25 years back or so, was the 3 Mile Island disaster with nuclear power plants, and then about the same time the movie China Syndrome came out, and it became a very big issue. We now see a potential movie, not a potential movie, coming out in this area, and one can predict that there will be big issues. I remember one case long ago where we were working with EPA. I was representing the state of New Jersey at the time, and we were announcing a remedy that the local residents were not happy with. We commanded a large audience, and lo and behold, about half the people showed up wearing skeleton costumes just to protest the situation. It was needless to say, a pretty raucous crowd. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do from a big picture perspective. Overall, there's a need for proactive planning. I think by now everybody should be well convinced that pretty much every airport is going to have a PFAS contamination problem, and the likelihood, it probably approaches about 100%. I mean, if any airport manages to escape this, I would really be surprised. What's one of the most important things, maybe the most important thing you should do immediately? That's assemble a PFAS team and do it now. Frank alluded to this, Dan alluded to this, I want to underscore it. You want to do this before the issue becomes public and before this mass hysteria that could happen begins to take hold. It already has happened with respect to some airports that have already had to deal with this issue, but it doesn't necessarily need to be your airport. So after you've got your team, you want to get your team to develop a plan. How are you going to deal with this? Sticking your head in the ground and avoiding and pretending the problem's not there is not a plan. Accepting reality and dealing with it is a plan. Very important, manage the media. Do not allow the media to manage you. Going back to the China Syndrome era, things got out of hand largely because the media really controlled the situation, and the power plants didn't do a very good job explaining their situation. It doesn't need to be that way. Airports can get ahead of it. Make sure you've got good media consultants, and definitely do get ahead of it. Be proactive, not reactive, especially with the regulators and the public. In other words, when you have bad information, it's best to manage it by admitting it and going forward and putting your best interpretive gloss on it rather than saying nothing, waiting for somebody to find out about that information, and then coming to you in a hurry and basically catching you unawares. So you control the dissemination of information, albeit within the confines of whatever your legal obligations might be. Also, keep abreast of all new PFAS developments. Things are changing rapidly in this area. Frank went through a rather long list of states that have done things, but states are changing these standards, and new standards are popping up all the time everywhere. Require your PFAS team to meet and plan regularly. Don't just act in response to a crisis, but anticipate the crisis before it happens and have that figured out in your plan. And maintain a hierarchy within your PFAS team. Avoid rogue players. Everybody should have an assignment. Everybody should know what their responsibilities are within the plan. You don't want a non-media person, for example, talking to the media unless it's been planned to happen that way. Also, with regard to who the team members should be, you certainly want your airport CEO to be a member. You want board representatives, if required, to be a member. You want your chief airport health and safety environmental officer to be a member, chief airport media officer, your airport counsel, an experienced environmental counsel, which may or may not be in the same firm as the airport counsel, but somebody who separately understands those issues and can place them in an airport context. Very important, well-qualified public relations firm and a well-qualified environmental consulting firm. You want to make sure that your individual team members do not overstep their responsibility and that they maintain discipline. You want to make sure that your team is not too large. It should be like a special forces and not the entire Army. I want to talk very quickly about the current regulatory landscape, because different agencies have different roles in this. You should expect to be answerable to both federal and state regulatory agencies, except in those states which have really not done anything. But as you can tell, many states are moving along these lines. The lines of demarcation are not always clear as to who has what authority, so you need to be prepared to address that. The EPA, the federal EPA's role is presently limited, and that's because right now PFAS materials are not designated as hazardous substances for CERCLA or Superfund purposes. We don't know what the legislature is going to do on this, but a fair bet is it's probably not going to compel that action. It will have to come from EPA. And given the current posture of the administration, that may not happen. So, at least for a while. So for a while, you may have this weird situation of having EPA's involvement through what amounts to a recommended standard of, or an advisory standard of 7 parts per trillion, but the real numbers are going to be driven by the individual states to the extent they change that. EPA has promised to take regulatory action, has promised to come out with things by the end of this year. We are not certain that they're going to do that. It remains to be seen. Suffice it to say, the regulatory environment is going to remain murky and confusing for quite some time to come. I want to talk about an issue that I call the delta effect. We've kind of danced around this a little bit earlier. You have at the federal level an advisory standard for PFAS of 70 parts per trillion, but it's not really binding. But then you have, at the state level, as Frank has illustrated, a bunch of states that are all over the place adopting different numbers, and they are intended to be binding. In fact, a number of states are moving actively toward listing PFAS as a hazardous substance under their state individual or mini Superfund laws. So what do you do in a situation where you have shared operations with the Department of Defense, as for example the El Paso airport, which I wouldn't say shared operations, but a nearby DoD facility, or you have a situation where you have legacy DoD impacts, but now it's a Part 139 commercial airport. you can expect to get pushback from DOD, who will, if anything, if they agree to do anything, only agree to clean up to the 70 parts per trillion standard or whatever other number EPA comes up with. But you, as the airport, may well still be responsible for remediating to a much lower state standard. That's the delta. There's a great amount of uncertainty there, and it's probably going to wind up in litigation somewhere to figure out what to do. So what can you do to protect yourself? I've got a number of specific ideas here, but in the interest of brevity, I'm going to just recommend that you take a look at this. I'll just focus on a couple of key things. Overall, I think the most important thing is to remain proactive. You definitely do, at least in our judgment, want to be out there figuring out what type of a problem you have and addressing the issue before it becomes a problem rather than after it becomes a problem. You also want to avoid premature disclosure, however, of things that you may find. When you go public with this, whether you go straight to a regulatory agency or you make some public declaration to the residents nearby informing them that there might be an issue with their groundwater, for example, you want to do so in the context of having all of the facts at your disposal first and a well-drafted plan in mind in terms of what you're proposing to do to address that issue. A way that is possible for you to protect yourself while you gather information, for example, while you have your environmental consultants out studying the problem, would be to do so under the auspices of counsel. And then counsel can inform you under the attorney-client privilege for a period of time as to what may be there. And then once that information has been thoroughly vetted and you've got your plan in place, then you can go public and you can avoid the issue about premature disclosure. You want to be proactive in working with regulatory agencies. Go to them rather than have them come to you. You want to be in a position where you can partner with them to try to resolve the matter. Surprisingly, not everybody in state regulatory agencies especially is into the command and control paradigm these days. They often are quite willing to work with you and to be reasonable under the circumstances. You also want to have your counsel, both general counsel and environmental counsel, work to develop legal strategies to minimize potential exposure to possible litigations and other claims, and also to figure out how best to process any claims that might need to be made by the airport itself against others. So, to use the DOD example earlier, if it becomes necessary to sue DOD or someone like that, you will have developed that strategy. Finally, in carrying out all these activities, we recommend that you liberally use the services of the public relations experts that you've hired. Remember, as I said earlier, the media are not your friends. That's all I have.
Thank you, Marty. We'll wrap up our sort of lecture part of it before we go to the Q&A, and we might run a few minutes over, but we'll stick to as close as we can to the time frame. The overview is, and this is also partly a shameless plug, that the entire range of issues related to PFAS is extremely fluid and it's going to remain so for quite some time. So given their history with the AFFF, airports are going to remain in the crosshairs of concern, and it's essential that each airport establish an airport team to address the issues as they come up. To that end, it's invaluable to have a legal team which has expertise and experience both in the airport field and in the environmental field. Obviously, we did this both to inform you and also to sort of an advertisement for ourselves. But just be aware that you're going to need more than your typical environmental experience, your typical airport experience. You're going to need combinations of all of those and experienced counsel and other consultants who can help you. With that, we'll go and move on to some of the Q&A. And again, I'll remind everybody we've got a few in already, but if anybody else has questions, please just go ahead and send them in by clicking the chat icon located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Now, the first question is, are there any accepted guidelines for soil and groundwater sampling procedure? For example, what materials to avoid, what PPEs to avoid? The question is really wants to be most interested in the guidelines applicable in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but this really goes to throughout the country. So let me ask Frank and Marty to start out with that one.
It's a very good question. The sampling technique for drinking water has been pretty well identified. The sampling technique for soil is not identified at all, and there's a lot of controversy about it. There's been none recognized in New Jersey, as an example, and it poses a problem as to how to deal with a discharge when you can't even figure out what's in the soil. Groundwater is pretty well defined, and various laboratories have different methods that they use, but it seems to be more accurate than others. As far as PPE, it's a great question. You also have a question of even the equipment that is in play here uses PFACs or PFASs, and there's a problem with that as well. So you do have problems of possibility of contamination from other sources as you proceed to test. But right now, the groundwater and the drinking water standards, methods of sampling are pretty well recognized, especially the drinking water. There's still some confusion and controversy on the groundwater, and on soil, there's no confusion or controversy. There's just no way that has been recognized as being able to measure it yet. These are items that we can look forward to. Marty?
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit to that. The EPA drinking water method is EPA method number 537.1. It's actually a modified method that labs have come up with, and one of the issues is that different labs have different means of modifying it, and so that's one of the reasons why you need to be careful about what lab you hire, and also why you sometimes get contrasting results. I'm not a scientist, but I understand there is another potential method known as LS, MS, MS isotope dilution. And don't ask me what that really means because I'm not a consultant. However, it appears to have some promise as a methodology to be used in all other media. The ASTM folks also have, I believe it's a proposed standard, I don't know that it's been official yet, it's called D7979 for water and D7968 for soil. But I'm unaware, and I think Frank is right about this, that this has ever been adopted anywhere, but it may be proposed to be used by some labs. EPA is presently looking into the development of other modifications to other types of standards for water generally and for soil and I guess other media. And references are to EPA 533, 8327, and 8328, which are under development. Finally, there is a QA protocol that the Department of Defense has issued. It's called QSM 5.2, and I believe it's available online. But it's a protocol to be used to test the validity or non-validity of usage of some of these other standards. It's not a standard in and of itself.
Marty, I want to thank you for bringing something out that's very important. I forgot to mention it. You're 100% right. Laboratories have modified their own little techniques. They call them proprietary, and that just adds further confusion. We're just going to have to wait a little while to see what testing protocols are going to be adopted, not only federally, but also statewide. It's a great question, whoever put that question in.
Before I ask the next question, and we're going to go over just a little bit, but I'm not going to keep, I know everybody's busy. I'm just going to actually interject here for a second and ask Marty if he can spend a minute or two just speaking about this from his own personal perspective, because interestingly, Marty lives right near what in many ways is ground zero of a lot of the PFAS, the Willow Grove Naval Air Station in Pennsylvania, where a lot of this was been litigated originally. And Marty's drinking water is actually that drinking water that has been affected by the PFAS. So you look at this not just from an environmental lawyer's perspective, but also this is the life that you live. So if you could just give a minute or two just from what is the experience of the people in and around Willow Grove in dealing with this issue.
Yeah, it's as you might surmise, it's become quite the big issue. The local newspapers and TV news reports are very prevalent. A lot of people are quite worried about it. There have been protests. The municipal governments have gotten involved. In terms of what's happening there, everybody there is on a public water supply system, save for a very few folks who are on their own drinking water wells. And that's somewhat of a saving grace because the water company is large and services a lot of people and has multiple water sources. So some areas that they draw water from in the groundwater don't really have the contaminants at levels that are high or even present. So what the water company has been doing is what water companies have often done in the past in these situations. It's essentially dilution to bring the levels down to whatever drinking water standards may be. But of course, they're using the 70 parts per trillion number, which is applicable in Pennsylvania. And that makes some people nervous because they're aware that right across the Delaware River, New Jersey has much lower numbers, but we're not in New Jersey. If you have a drinking water well, my understanding is that the Department of Navy, which is managing the cleanup at Willow Grove, has put what they call POETs, or Point of Entry Treatment System devices, or kind of like Culligan devices on individual houses that use granular activated carbon, or what they call GAC, to treat this material. And it does bring down the levels to within manageable levels.
Which raises the next question, and we'll take just one or two more before we sign off, and that is there a way actually to remediate PFAS contamination in the soil and in groundwater?
There have been, and I believe there are, a number of companies that are looking into proprietary technologies that might work to deal with soil. Strangely enough, a number of these are in Australia for some reason. They're quite a bit more proactive about remediation there than we are here, and a bit in Europe. I'm unaware that there's any consensus at the present time for soils remediation, and in some instances, just based on cost effectiveness alone, it's often concluded that just digging the stuff out of the ground and then staging the soil and then dealing with the disposal of the soil is a separate issue, is the best way to remediate what's in the ground. But then you've got lots and lots of secondary issues about how to destroy it, whether it can go into landfills, whether it should go into a hazardous waste landfill as opposed to a regular landfill, whether it can be incinerated, and the jury is still out on those issues.
Just a couple of little comments on that. If you have some materials that are in a drum and they're legacy materials that you want to get rid of, the practice these days has been to incinerate. But Marty's right, there's still a lot of concerns about that as well. The cost is about $800 a drum. You got to incinerate between 1100 to 1300 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's a considerable expense. So you can see where this is going once you've got to get rid of some soil as well. The jury is out on other methods. They're being tried. One of the best methods, at least currently, is if you take that same drum to a secure landfill. Now, a secure landfill is going to be one that has all kinds of safeguards to it, monitoring safeguards and some safeguards that would be making sure that you don't have any impact to groundwater from the landfill. So those are the two methods of getting rid of this stuff, except for one other one, and that is the 3M company has launched a take-back program. If you got your materials somehow through 3M, they will take back the materials if they are legacy materials. That doesn't necessarily answer the question as far as what to do with mitigation, mitigating a condition, an environmental condition of the groundwater, the soil, and Marty answered that pretty well. Thank you.
I'm going to thank everybody at this point and not continue to take everybody's time, even though it's a subject that can be discussed forever. I want to thank Lauren and Frank and Marty. I want to thank our marketing person, Molly Graham, our technical person, Roger Rancis, and everybody out there who was involved in this presentation. This is something we'll be talking about for a long time. We wish you a very good rest of the day and hope that it is profitable and successful for all of you. Thank you very much.